The static hissed like a cornered snake. On the main holographic display in the Tactical Operations Center, the topography of the Zorinthos Basin shimmered in ghostly blue light. Red icons, designated hostile, clustered in a narrow valley known colloquially as the Serpent's Tooth. Deeper within that rocky maw, for friendly icons, callsign Pathfinder, blinked erratically. They were pinned, their communications garbled by the sheer density of jamming and the rising shriek of an inbound sandstorm. Status on air support? Colonel Marcus Thorne's voice was a low grind of gravel, worn down by 20 years of command and a profound intolerance for failure. His jaw was a hard line of granite beneath a day's worth of stubble. A young lieutenant at the comms console flinched. Negative, sir. The Haboob is moving faster than projected. Visibility is 0. Airspeed indicators will be unreliable, and the sand density is high enough to cause engine flameout. All birds are grounded. It's a hard no-fly zone. Thorne's fist tightened on the edge of the console. So Pathfinder is on their own, it wasn't a question. It was a death sentence being read aloud. They had been chasing a high-value target, a brilliant bomb maker known only as the Alchemist, and had walked straight into a perfectly laid trap. The Alchemist was now in a fortified technical, preparing to exfiltrate through the rear of the valley while his forces bled Pathfinder dry. Across the room, standing by the weather monitoring station, Captain Eva Rostova said nothing. She was a pilot, one of the best, but she was new to this forward operating base, a recent transfer with a file that was suspiciously thin on commendations and heavy on assignments to quiet backwater posts. She was of medium height, with a compact, athletic build that seemed designed for the cramped cockpit of an AH-64E Apache Guardian. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, regulation bun, and her eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, missed nothing. She watched the anemometer readings spike, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. "There's a low-altitude corridor," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tense hum of the TOC. "It follows the dry riverbed on the western approach. It's tight, but it should be below the worst of the particulate flow. The canyon walls would shield a single aircraft from the crosswinds." Thorne turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over her with palpable skepticism. He saw a captain, a mid-level officer, offering a textbook solution to a real-world nightmare. A solution that ignored a dozen variables, each one fatal. "A corridor?" Thorne scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. "You mean a coffin? That's nap of the earth flying in a sandstorm with 0 visibility, surrounded by granite. It's not just risky, Captain. It's suicidal. We don't sacrifice a $60 million Apache and its crew on a 1% chance." He turned back to the map, dismissing her as thoroughly as if he had waved his hand. "Get me a drone feed, even if it only lasts for 30 seconds before the sand strips it clean. I want to see what's killing my men." Eva's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or cite her flight hours. She simply absorbed the dismissal, her calm exterior a perfect mask for the cold, precise calculations spooling through her mind. She knew the canyon. She had studied it for weeks, memorizing every turn, every outcrop, every thermal signature on the satellite overlays. The colonel saw a coffin. She saw a keyhole, and she was the only one who held the key. While the men in the room scrambled for a failing technological solution, she turned and walked out of the TOC, her footsteps making no sound against the concrete floor. The storm was coming, and with it, her chance to fly. The dismissal in the TOC hung in the air like cordite, a bitter taste in Eva's mouth. Thorne hadn't just rejected her idea. He had belittled it, painting her as a reckless amateur in front of his entire command staff. He saw her flight suit and her rank, but he didn't see the years of relentless practice, the thousands of hours spent in simulators flying impossible scenarios, the lineage of flight that ran in her blood. He saw a risk to his hardware. She saw the blinking icons of 4 soldiers whose time was running out. She walked with a purpose that defied the colonel's direct order to stand down. The wind was already picking up, a low moan that promised a coming fury. It whipped fine grains of sand across the tarmac, a prelude to the blinding wall of dust visible on the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. Her destination was Hangar 4, where her bird, Valkyrie 7, sat silent and waiting. It wasn't the newest Apache on the flight line, its olive-drab skin scarred with the faint outlines of patched bullet holes and the wear of countless flight hours. But it was hers. She knew its every groan, its every subtle vibration. Inside the cavernous hangar, the wind howled through the open doors, rattling tools and kicking up small eddies of dust. Specialist Leo Davies, her crew chief, was running a final diagnostic on the TEDIS/PNVS turret. His young face, barely out of its teens, etched with concentration. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting from focus to surprise, and then to a dawning understanding. "Captain?" he asked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Colonel Thorne grounded everyone, said the sand would tear the blades to pieces. "The blades can be replaced. The men in that valley can't," Eva stated simply. Her tone was flat, devoid of bravado. It was a statement of fact. "I need you to run the pre-flight. Full weapons loadout. 8 Hellfires, full rocket pods, and load the 30 mil with HEDP. Leo hesitated for only a second, his eyes darting toward the hangar door as if expecting the colonel himself to stride through it. He had only been assigned to Captain Rostova for 2 months, but he had seen her in the simulators. He had watched her fly practice runs that made veteran pilots sweat. He had seen the quiet, almost reverent way she treated her aircraft, not as a machine, but as a partner. He trusted that calm, focused intensity more than he trusted the colonel's loud, by-the-book pronouncements. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice firm. He turned and began moving with an efficiency that belied his age, pulling the missile carts into position and signaling to the ordnance team. Eva walked to the cockpit and pulled herself up. She began her own ritual, her hands moving with an ingrained, fluid muscle memory across the instrument panel. She didn't need a checklist. The sequence was written into her nervous system. Battery on. PU start. The familiar high-pitched whine filled the cockpit, a sound as comforting to her as a heartbeat. As the systems blinked to life, her eyes fell on a small, worn leather patch velcroed to the dashboard, just above the main multifunction display. It was an old test pilot's patch, faded and cracked with age, depicting a stylized hawk diving through a thunderhead. It had belonged to her father. He was a legend, a man who flew experimental aircraft on the very edge of the envelope, a man who taught her that the only true limits were self-imposed. He used to say, "The machine will tell you what it can do. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." She strapped herself into the seat, the 5-point harness clicking into place with 5 sharp, definitive sounds. She pulled on her helmet, the integrated helmet and display sighting system sliding over her head and connecting her directly to the Apache senses. The world outside dissolved, replaced by the green-hued symbology of the heads-up display. Leo's voice crackled in her ear. "Ma'am, systems are green. We're hot. Valkyrie 7 is ready to hunt." Eva's hand rested on the collective. She looked out through the armored canopy at the roiling, yellow-brown wall of the Haboob that was now consuming the distant mountains. Thorne saw an obstacle. Her father would have seen a challenge. Eva saw something else entirely. She saw cover. She saw the perfect cloak for a ghost. Opening the hangar doors, "Captain," Leo's voice came over the internal comms, tight with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "Godspeed, Nix." He used her old call sign, one from a previous unit, a name whispered with a certain reverence by those who had flown with her before. Nix, the primordial goddess of the night, the one who moved unseen. The massive hangar doors groaned open, revealing a world that had vanished into a maelstrom of sand. The sky was gone, replaced by a churning, opaque curtain of ochre. The wind shrieked, a physical force that buffeted the 30,000-pound attack helicopter. Eva could feel the individual grains of sand already beginning to scour the canopy, a high-pitched, abrasive hiss. Any other pilot would have shut down the engines. It was an act of mechanical suicide to even contemplate taking off. Eva's hands were steady on the controls. Her gaze was fixed not on the chaos outside, but on the glowing green symbology projected onto her visor. Altitude, airspeed, torque, rotor RPM. These were her reality now. The storm was just data, a set of variables to be managed. She eased the collective up, feeding power to the massive rotor blades. The Apache shuddered, fighting against the violent crosswinds. The distinctive whomp 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 of the blades deepened into a powerful, guttural roar as they bit into the thick, particle-laden air. "TOC is lighting up my comms," Leo's voice crackled, strained. "Colonel Thorne is demanding to know your intentions." "Tell him my intentions are to save his men," Eva replied, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm's fury. She didn't have time for a debate. Every second wasted was another round of enemy fire impacting Pathfinder's position. She lifted off, the Apache rising not with a smooth ascent, but with a jarring, crab-like motion as she compensated for a sudden gust that threatened to push her sideways into the hangar wall. Once clear of the ground, she nosed the aircraft down, keeping it low, barely 20 feet above the tarmac. She flew blind, navigating by the digital map on her MFD and the terrain-following radar that painted a wireframe image of the world in front of her. The FOB disappeared behind her in less than a second, swallowed by the sand. She was alone, a $60 million machine flying through a hurricane of rock and dust, guided by the quiet confidence of its pilot. Her target was the mouth of the dry riverbed, the entrance to the Serpent's Tooth. The radar showed it as a narrow slit in a ridge of solid rock, an opening barely wider than her rotor span. According to the colonel, it was a coffin. The flight to the canyon mouth was a brutal, 10-minute battle against physics. The sand acted like a viscous fluid, creating immense drag and threatening to choke the T-700 engines. Alarms screamed intermittently in her headset: engine temperature, particle separator overload, pitot tube obstruction. She calmly acknowledged and silenced each one, making micro-adjustments to her power settings, finessing the machine, listening to its labored breathing. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't fight the storm, Evie. Dance with it. Let it lead, you follow." She found the entrance to the canyon not by sight, but by the sudden lull in the crosswind. The wireframe on her display confirmed it. She was there. Taking a steadying breath, she banked the Apache sharply, committing herself to the narrow passage. Instantly, the world changed. The roar of the open storm was replaced by a claustrophobic echo. The sound of her own rotor wash bounced off the canyon walls, creating a disorienting cacophony. The walls were so close she could see their ghostly, radar-painted outlines just beyond the tips of her blades. She was flying at over 100 knots through a tunnel carved by ancient water, with less than 15 feet of clearance on either side. This was where instinct took over, where machine and pilot truly merged. Her hands on the cyclic and collective moved not in conscious commands, but in a fluid, continuous stream of reactions. She wasn't just piloting. She was feeling the air currents, anticipating the twists and turns of the canyon before the radar could even paint them. The Apache, a machine of brute force and overwhelming firepower, moved with the grace of a dragonfly, its belly skimming just feet above the sandy riverbed. Inside the TOC, her unauthorized IFF tag was a single, defiant green chevron moving where no aircraft should be. Colonel Thorne stared at it, his face a mask of incandescent fury that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to morph into something else. Disbelief. Awe. He had written her off as dead the moment she lifted off. But the chevron kept moving, steady and purposeful, plunging deeper into the heart of the Serpent's Tooth, flying a route that the simulators and every experienced pilot on his staff had labeled as impossible. The canyon finally opened into the wider valley, and the transition was breathtaking. One moment, Eva was enveloped in the tight, echoing confines of the rock passage. The next, she burst into the relative calm of the valley floor. Here, the high canyon walls created a lee from the worst of the haboob. The air was still thick with dust, but visibility had improved from 0 to a few hundred meters. A murky twilight world where shapes moved like phantoms. Her helmet display immediately tagged the sources of gunfire. The angry red strobes of muzzle flashes painted a clear picture of Pathfinder's predicament. The four-man team was pinned behind a small, rocky outcrop, taking effective fire from at least 3 well-entrenched machine gun positions on the valley slopes. Further back, nestled in a protected alcove, sat the HVT's prize technical, a heavily modified truck with a sinister-looking antenna array sprouting from its roof. But Eva's first priority wasn't the machine guns or even the alchemist. Her training, her very instinct, screamed threat assessment. Her eyes, augmented by the TADS thermal imaging, scanned the area with methodical precision. And then she saw it. Tucked behind a dune, its crew hastily trying to get it operational, was a ZU-23-2, a twin-barreled anti-aircraft gun. It was the queen on this chessboard, the one piece that could take her out of the sky. They hadn't expected air support, so they had been slow to deploy it. That was their mistake. It would be their last. Valkyrie 7 to Pathfinder, she transmitted, her voice cutting through their panicked, static-filled comms. Hold tight. I'm on station. A burst of garbled, astonished relief was her only reply. On the ground, Sergeant Cole Stalker Riley, Pathfinder's leader, had been sure they were dead. He had been counting his remaining ammunition, preparing to sell their lives dearly. Then, out of the dust-choked sky, a voice. Not the clipped, procedural tone of a standard CS check-in, but something calmer, colder. He risked a glance over his cover and saw it. Phantom, an Apache hovering almost silently less than 50 feet off the deck, its form a nightmarish silhouette in the gloom. It had made no sound on its approach. It had simply appeared. In the cockpit, Eva's fingers danced across the weapon's control panel. Laser on, she murmured, her thumb depressing the designator button on her control grip. A targeting box appeared on her display, settling perfectly over the ZU-23-2. Weapon selected, Hellfire. Seeker mode, SAL. The system chirped, confirming a solid lock. The enemy crew, now aware of her presence, scrambled frantically to traverse their weapon. They were too slow. Firing one, Eva said to herself. There was no thunderous explosion, just a quiet whoosh as the AGM-114 missile dropped from the pylon and its rocket motor ignited. A brief, bright flare in the dusty air. It streaked across the valley, a sliver of guided death. Eva didn't watch it. She was already retasking her sensors, identifying the next target. The 8 seconds it took for the missile to reach its destination felt like an eternity. For the crew of the ZU-23-2, the world ended in a flash of white-hot light. The Hellfire's shaped charge detonated with devastating precision, turning the anti-aircraft gun and its operators into a cloud of superheated shrapnel and vaporized metal. The resulting explosion was a dull, heavy thump that was felt more than heard through the thick air. The sudden, violent silence that followed was more shocking than the gunfire had been. One of the machine gun nests, spooked by the apparition in the sky and the obliteration of their air defense, ceased firing. The tide hadn't just turned. A dam had broken. Back in the TOC, the stunned silence was just as profound. They had seen the Hellfire launch on the satellite feed, a tiny flare followed by a thermal bloom. Colonel Thorne leaned forward, his knuckles white where he gripped the console. "Who is that pilot?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Get me a name." Now the lieutenant scrambled, his fingers flying across his keyboard, pulling up the flight roster, his eyes widening as he cross-referenced it with the transponder code for Valkyrie 7. The impossible pilot had a name, Rostova. The destruction of the anti-aircraft gun sent a ripple of panic through the enemy force. Their sense of absolute security, their belief that the storm was their impenetrable shield, had been shattered. The alchemist, a man who dealt in cold, calculated equations of risk and reward, immediately understood the new variable. He barked orders into his radio, his voice sharp with urgency. This was no longer a methodical execution. It was a desperate scramble for survival. The remaining 2 machine gun nests, manned by more disciplined fighters, adapted their tactics. They shifted their fire, no longer concentrating solely on Pathfinder, but sending probing bursts of tracers toward the ghostly shape of the Apache. They were trying to force her to move, to expose herself, to make a mistake. At the same time, the HVT's technical roared to life, its heavy diesel engine a guttural growl in the sudden quiet. It lurched forward, not away from the fight, but deeper into the cluster of rocks near Pathfinder's position. The alchemist was clever. He was using the pinned-down soldiers as a human shield. He knew any missile strike against his vehicle now carried a high probability of killing the very men the helicopter was there to save. He was betting the American pilot wouldn't take that risk. From her vantage point, Eva saw the tactical shift instantly. The glowing heat signatures of the enemy fighters moved with purpose. The technical maneuvered with a driver who clearly knew the terrain, weaving between tall spires of rock that offered intermittent cover. Pathfinder, be advised, HVT is using your position for cover. I do not have a clean shot, she broadcasted, her voice remaining steady, betraying none of the frustration she felt. Copy, Valkyrie, Sergeant Riley responded, the static on his comms clearing slightly. We see him. We can't suppress him and the nests at the same time. In the TOC, the dynamic had shifted completely. The initial fury at an unauthorized flight had been replaced by a tense, focused silence. Every officer in the room was glued to the main display, watching the drama unfold in real time through the grainy, intermittent feed of a high-altitude drone that was bravely fighting the storm. They could see the tactical problem as clearly as Eva could. She's boxed in, Thorne murmured almost to himself. If she goes high to get an angle on the technical, the remaining MGs will have a clear shot at her belly. If she stays low, the friendlies are in the splash zone. He's got her. It was a grudging admission of the enemy commander's skill. But Thorne was calculating based on standard operational parameters. He was thinking like a pilot, but Eva was thinking like a predator. She saw the terrain not as a set of obstacles, but as a weapon she could use. The rock spires that the HVT was using for cover were tall, sheer cliffs of granite. One of them stood directly between her and the technical, a massive, unmoving sentinel. Leo, she said into the internal comm, speaking to her crew chief back at the FOB who was monitoring her systems remotely. Give me a live feed of engine torque and blade stress. I'm going to try something unconventional. Pause, then Leo's voice, tight with anxiety. Captain, whatever you're planning, the particle separators are already at 90%. You push the engines any harder and they'll choke. Copy that, was all she said. She dipped the Apache's nose and slid sideways, disappearing behind the largest of the rock spires, breaking line of sight with every enemy fighter. For a moment, she was completely hidden. On the ground, Sergeant Riley's heart sank. He thought she was repositioning or worse, bugging out. The enemy fighters, emboldened by her disappearance, renewed their fire on Pathfinder's position with a vengeance. In the TOC, Thorne swore under his breath. What is she doing? She just gave up her position of dominance. But Eva hadn't given up anything. She had just changed the rules of the engagement. Hidden behind the rock, she brought the Apache to a near-perfect hover, the rotor wash blasting sand and pebbles away from the cliff face. Her eyes were glued to her instruments. She began to feed power to the engines, pushing the collective pitch of the blades, but instead of moving forward or backward, she held the cyclic perfectly neutral. She was asking the helicopter to do something it was never designed for, a pure, vertical, high-power ascent, like an elevator rising up the side of a skyscraper. The aircraft groaned in protest. The twin turbines screamed, their RPMs climbing into the red. Alarms blared in her ears. Engine over torque, rotor RPM low. She ignored them, her entire being focused on the delicate balance of forces. She was flying by feel, by the vibration in her seat, by the deep, shuddering groans of the airframe. She was listening to the machine, just as her father had taught her. Then she executed the maneuver. Slowly, impossibly, the nose of Valkyrie 7 rose above the razor-sharp edge of the ridge. It didn't rocket up. It ascended with a ghostly, silent grace. From the enemy's perspective, it was a horrifying apparition. One moment there was nothing but rock. The next, the menacing, insectoid head of an Apache gunship materialized out of thin air, its hideous turret already swiveling, its multi-lens eye glowing like a cyclops. It was perfectly motionless, hanging in the air as if suspended by wires, its body still concealed by the cliff. The maneuver was a pinnacle hover, a high-risk technique used to peek over ridgelines, but no one had ever attempted it in a sandstorm with engines already on the verge of choking out. For a split second, everyone on the battlefield, friend and foe alike, was frozen in stunned disbelief. That second was all Eva needed. Her view was perfect. She was looking almost straight down at the top of the HVT's technical, which was now completely exposed. Pathfinder was safely shielded by the angle of the rock. "That is locked," she whispered. Her thumb moved with surgical precision. This time she didn't select a Hellfire. Overkill and the splash damage was still a remote possibility. She selected the 30mm M230 chain gun. Firing solution calculated. The gun, slaved to her helmet, tracked her gaze perfectly. A stream of 30mm high-explosive dual-purpose rounds, firing at a rate of 10 rounds per second, stitched a perfectly straight line across the engine block and front cabin of the technical. The sound was not the loud roar of a machine gun, but a deep, guttural thump-thump-thump-thump-thump, like a giant hammering on a steel door. The rounds tore through the vehicle's thin armor as if it were paper. The engine block disintegrated. The cabin erupted in a flash of fire and smoke as the ammunition and electronics inside cooked off. The technical slewed to a halt, crippled and burning, its deadly antenna array slumping to one side like a broken flower. The alchemist's escape route was closed. Permanently. Having delivered the killing blow, Eva didn't linger. Before the shocked machine gunners could react, she let the Apache slide back down behind the rock spire, disappearing as mysteriously as she had appeared. The entire engagement, from her appearance above the ridge to the neutralization of the target, had taken less than 5 seconds. It was a masterpiece of positioning, audacity, and lethal precision. The psychological impact on the remaining enemy fighters was devastating. They had watched their ace in the hole, their anti-aircraft weapon, be vaporized. They had watched their brilliant leader, a man they believed to be invincible, get surgically executed by a ghost that appeared and disappeared at will. Their will to fight evaporated. From behind her rock cover, Eva listened to their panicked chatter on the wideband scanner. It was disorganized, chaotic. They were breaking. "Pathfinder, this is Valkyrie," she transmitted, her voice still impossibly calm. "HVT is neutralized. I'm commencing suppression run on the remaining hostiles. Prepare to move on my mark. Solid copy, Valkyrie." Sergeant Riley's voice was filled with a raw, breathless awe. "We are ready to move. You are an angel of death, ma'am. An honest-to-God angel of death." Eva didn't acknowledge the compliment. She nosed the Apache around the edge of the rock spire, this time coming in low and fast. The 2 remaining machine gun nests were now her only focus. The fighters, seeing her approach, threw down a wild, inaccurate spray of fire, their discipline gone. She selected her 275-inch rockets, firing a pair of flechette rounds into the position on the right. The pod hissed, and 2 rockets streaked across the short distance, detonating in the air above the nest and releasing thousands of tiny steel darts. The enemy fire from that position ceased instantly. For the final nest, she used the 30mm again, but not with the surgical precision she used on the technical. She walked the rounds up the slope toward their position, a terrifying display of controlled firepower. The deep, rhythmic thumping of the chain gun echoed through the valley as the high-explosive rounds chewed up the rock and sand around them. The surviving fighters broke and ran, abandoning their heavy weapon and melting into the rocks, desperate to escape the wrath of the machine that had materialized from their worst nightmare. "All stations, this is Valkyrie 7. Eva broadcast, her voice now cutting across all channels, including the command net back at the TOC. Threat neutralized. Valley is secure. Pathfinder, you are clear to advance on the objective and prepare for extraction. I will remain on station to provide overwatch." In the TOC, a collective, audible breath was released. The tension that had held the room in a vice-like grip for the last 20 minutes finally broke. Officers and enlisted personnel alike stared at the screen, at the smoking ruin of the technical and the green icons of Pathfinder beginning to move forward. They had just witnessed the impossible. Colonel Thorne stood ramrod straight, his eyes locked on the IFF tag of Valkyrie 7. It circled the valley lazily, a hawk guarding its territory. The fury was gone, replaced by a profound, unsettling sense of professional shock. He had been wrong. So fundamentally, absolutely wrong. He had quoted regulations and risk assessments. This pilot, this Captain Rostova, had rewritten the entire book in the middle of a sandstorm. "Lieutenant," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying the full weight of his authority. "Get me Captain Rostova's full service record. Not the redacted version. The original. I want to know everything. I want to know who the hell I just sent into that canyon." He had a sinking feeling he already knew. The callsign Leo had used, Nix, was starting to connect with half-forgotten whispers and after-action reports from other theaters of war. Stories of a ghost pilot in an Apache who turned doomed fights around, a pilot who flew in weather that grounded entire air wings. He had always dismissed them as exaggerated hangar talk. Until now. The dust began to settle in the Zerinthos basin, both literally and figuratively. With Eva circling protectively overhead, Pathfinder team moved with swift efficiency. They secured the intel from the wrecked technical, laptops, coded documents, and satellite phones that would cripple the Alchemist's network for months to come. Within 30 minutes, a heavy-lift helicopter, a SH-47 Chinook, braved the now-subsiding storm to extract the team and their prize. Eva maintained her overwatch until the Chinook was well clear of the valley, a silent guardian watching them to safety. Only then did she turn Valkyrie 7 for home. The return flight was as treacherous as the ingress, but the pressure was off. The engines, though strained, performed. The sand had scoured the canopy to a translucent haze, and every inch of the airframe was coated in a fine, gritty film. She landed the Apache back on the FOB's tarmac with a gentleness that defied the battered condition of the aircraft. As the engine spooled down with a final weary whine, a profound silence fell over the flight line. Ground crews who would normally be swarming the aircraft stood back, their movements slow and respectful. They stared at the helicopter, its blades drooping, its skin sandblasted to a dull matte finish, as if it were a living creature that had returned from hell. Eva went through her shutdown sequence with the same methodical calm she did everything else. When the systems were cold and the cockpit was dark, she finally allowed herself a moment. She rested her forehead against the cool glass of the canopy, the fine grit scratching her skin. She could feel the fatigue settling deep into her bones, a heavy, leaden weight. When she unstrapped and climbed down, Colonel Thorne was there. He wasn't flanked by his aides. He was alone, standing a few feet from the cockpit, his expression unreadable. The setting sun broke through the last of the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Eva met his gaze without flinching. She was prepared for the reprimand, for the court-martial that would surely follow for disobeying a direct order and endangering a valuable asset. She had made her choice. She would live with the consequences. Thorne walked closer, his eyes not on her, but on the helicopter. He ran a hand over the fuselage, his fingers coming away coated in dust. He looked at the leading edges of the rotor blades, which were pitted and worn, looking like they had been worked over with a belt sander. The damage was extensive. The repairs would take weeks. Finally, he looked at her. "The official report will state that I authorized a high-risk reconnaissance flight based on a sudden, localized break in the weather," he said, his voice low and even. "It will state that you encountered the enemy by chance and acted decisively to defend a friendly unit in peril. Your actions will be noted for commendation." Eva was stunned into silence. This was not the reaction she had expected. Thorne took a step closer. "I pulled your sealed file, Captain. Your real file. Your father was General Ivan Rostova, chief test pilot for the RH-66 Comanche program. He wrote the manual on Nap of the Earth flight in adverse conditions. Literally wrote the book. He paused, his eyes searching hers. They called him the Ghost in Kandahar. There were stories about a pilot they called Nix, a pilot who flew a lone Apache on night raids, taking out targets that entire squadrons couldn't touch. A pilot who disappeared from the rolls 2 years ago after a mission went sideways and command buried her to cover their own mistakes. That was you, wasn't it? Eva gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The legend wasn't something she cultivated. It was a weight she carried. Thorne let out a long, slow breath. He looked from her to the battered helicopter and back again. The institutional arrogance, the by-the-book certainty, had been stripped away, scoured clean just like the paint on her Apache. He saw her now not as a subordinate who had disobeyed him, but as a warrior who had succeeded where he would have failed. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a salute. He did something that, for a man like Marcus Thorne, was far more significant. He met her eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound, unvarnished respect, an acknowledgement from one professional to another. "Welcome back to the fight, Nix," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her machine. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The wind was now just a gentle breeze, cool and clean. The air smelled of rain-washed dust and hot metal. Leo Davies approached, holding a toolkit, his young face streaked with grime but lit with an expression of pure reverence. He didn't say a word about the battle, about the colonel, about the impossible flight. He just looked at the helicopter. "She's going to need a lot of work, Captain," he said, his voice soft. Eva reached out and laid a hand on the scarred fuselage of Valkyrie 7. She could feel the residual heat of the engines, the faint vibration of cooling metal. The machine had trusted her, and she had trusted it. Together, they had danced with the storm and emerged victorious. "We all do, Chief," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "We all do." She stood there for a long time as darkness fell, her hand resting on the airframe. The lights of the FOB flickered on, one by one, chasing away the last of the shadows. The legend of Nix was no longer a ghost story whispered in dusty hangars. It was real. It was standing right here, covered in the fine sand of the Zerinthos Basin. Her quiet dignity her only armor, the silent, powerful machine her only testament. The storm had passed. The silence that remained was one of respect, earned not with words, but with a single impossible flight.